what is driving digital transformation for these utilities? Matt, you want to take that?
Sure. Really, we're at a big evolution that's happening at rapid speed, and this paradox that's happening, within the utility industry, whether you're looking at how we bring power to market, how we store power, the consumption of power, and really, the different types of customers today and what their requirements are, and even some of the competition that's coming in the space. But when Bala and I have the opportunity to, sit down with executives and help them with some of their strategic initiatives, the three main pillars that we consistently see is, really about innovation. And so, utilities, when you look at the grid side, have always been very, very much rooted in innovation and looking at ways to continue to improve, how they manage, their grids and resilience of those grids and so on. What you're starting to see a shift now is really kind of on the back office and operations side, and really how do we digitize and how do we transform kind of our core back office, and then how do we bring those two together? So innovation is a huge part of, and even looking at things like mixed reality and augmented reality, how do we empower field personnel, to deliver better quality and kind of have learnings, on the fly. Operationally, this has always been a cornerstone. We're constantly looking at how do we more efficiently, effectively, and predictably manage our resources, people and partners, as well as assets. And then growth. Growth is not just about, the profitability or revenue side that we may see that's important with investor-owned utilities, but it's also important on the cost side. And you think of some of the challenges like co-ops are having in some of the municipalities and so on, where they're having these massive growth, from a population, in these rural areas. And so the pace by which we have to plan for growth and how we plan our capital projects, is tremendously changing. So as a result of that, it's making us rethink our strategies in how we look at investing in technologies to deal with this paradigm shift that we're seeing. So Bala, I know you and I have talked about what we call the 5 Ds, if you can take us, into that discussion.
Sure, Matt. I think you talked about innovation, and then you talked about operations, and you talked about growth, right? I think the first two pillars are fairly common to any traditional industry segment, such as the utilities, right? So as you see here, the first 2 Ds, especially the decarbonization, decentralization, I think are broadly themes that the utility companies have been drivers of transformation. But I think I would like to touch upon the growth factor, right? I think how does a traditional industry segment like a utilities, right, clearly build growth through asset-light models, and what's driving that are really the 3 Ds to the right of the slide, right, which essentially is it's getting consumerized, very unlike the asset-heavy sort of industries, right? So I think the entire downstream in the utility segment is getting consumerized, where the consumer is having more preferences, is getting much more empowered, and they're actually becoming prosumers, a terminology where they not only consume from the grid, they contribute to the grid, right? The other approach to transformation is, of course, the DNO to DSO, where a lot of utility companies have been trying to sort of embark on this for the last 3-4 years. But I think now it's the time. I don't think they have an option. So I think the emerging business models and also the empowerment of the consumer really paves the natural transformation from DNO to DSO. And the third one, really, needless to say, is really about those young digital natives that are coming in from different other industry segments, which are sort of disrupting every other traditional industry segment. And I don't think the utility segment is protected from them. So a lot of digital natives in terms of giving unique, innovative services for customers, both in downstream and also digitizing the grid as part of the upstream. So broadly extending on what Matt, that you were highlighting in terms of innovation and operations and growth, I think if you double click on some of those, at least 2 of those engines, right? I see this is a clear shift, and this requires a new dimension of thinking, reimagining the business for the utility guys to thrive in the new marketplace.
Yeah, and it's, I think the challenge is that, when you look at traditional businesses like utility, and we've been somewhat isolated in our own world, trying to solve our own, challenges, and and focusing on what we do as a core competency. That the shift is really getting us a bit outside our comfort zone, and is forcing us, to really look at a change, and whether we like it or not, and really look at, how we operate the business, how we drive more predictable, cost or revenue, and then how do we create innovation, is really, at the tip of the spear right now.
Sure.
So what kind of comes out of this is this whole concept of ecosystems, kind of started by McKinsey, and really about what's happening in the business world today is that we've got different contributors entering our value chain that have different ecosystems. And even within our own organization, we have different ecosystems, whether you look at long cycle, short cycle work, plant maintenance versus management of grid, and so on. And so what you're seeing evolved, and Bala, you've seen this across multiple industries, is really this concept of these ecosystems and understanding the importance of ecosystems and what's our role going to be in that. Are we going to be a builder of an ecosystem that others are going to come in and be participants of? Are we going to be an orchestrator? So we're operating kind of is that middle value chain to, upstream and downstream contributors, within an ecosystem. Are we simply participants? Maybe it's in our customers are requiring us to work within their system. So we have very unique IP or API rather, integration requirements that we have. So, Bala, kind of talk us through what's, this shift that's happening really in multiple industries today.
Quite simply put, Matt, I think the traditional industry walls are getting broken, right? Which essentially means that value creation has taken a new meaning, right? It's not really that if you are a retailer, if you are a utility player, or if you are probably in the education or the health, you could be disrupted by pretty much anyone else in some other different segment. I mean, for all you know, the largest taxi company does not own any taxis, right? The largest hotel company or hospitality company does not own any physical assets or rooms, right? So I think the value creation is taking a completely new meaning. And very rightly, I think McKinsey is sort of talking about a redefinition of this economic value creation to the tune of about, by 2025, to about $60 trillion of business being completely value created in a different way, right? So I'm seeing this across different industry segments. Maybe some are in very early stages, whereas some of the natural segments for disruption include very consumer-focused segments like the retail or the financial services or media. But then some of the larger traditional industrial segments like manufacturing, utilities, which are slightly asset-heavy. But I'm saying manufacturing is being driven by IoT, and IoT is really creating different, and data is creating newer ecosystems. So there is a secular shift across industry segments, but the manifestation of it and the speed at which it is impacting every industry segment, I think, is varies. And it would be interesting for us to discuss, Matt, and how is this impacting the utilities, and what sort of an approach would traditional utility companies really have to take, right, in this new world and new dimension.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things to look at. One is, what are we seeing out there, Bala, and the conversations we're having on a regular basis. I mean, it even just, this year versus last year with some of our utility customers, and, whether they're already in some expanded service offerings. The example I'll give you is co-ops. We're seeing some of our co-op customers get into home services, get into telecom, and looking at bringing more value to their ecosystem. Or you're seeing, we're seeing in some cases retailers that are now getting into the downstream services side. So, and as a result of that, it's creating a totally different business model that we have to look at, and we have to rethink, our core business and how we can adapt to really support these new business models. And so there's two kind of paradigms that are happening. One, when we look at kind of the core, and I'll let you give some perspective on that, because I think you've got a really good perspective on this, but when you kind of look at the three big pillars and kind of what we know, kind of traditional utility versus, where we see this paradigm shift and where we see some of our customers that are in different stages of this evolution, we're seeing this whole concept come to reality that we were just talking about in the kind of McKinsey model of these ecosystems. So two things. One, you're seeing a migration into markets that utilities otherwise didn't compete in. So being very disruptive. And then you're also seeing competitors that are coming into the core business as we know it in changing things like, how we manage our grid, how we manage our operations and so on. So Bala, give us some kind of insights as well as what you're seeing.
Sure, Matt. So I think to cut the long story short, right, I think the utility companies will have to come out of their comfort zone, right? And what does a traditional transformation typically mean? It typically means for a segment like utilities, it typically means rationalization. It typically means bringing in efficiencies, cost takeouts, right? Or it typically means mergers or demergers. So I think these are traditional approaches for transformation, right? But I think with the new order of the way the industry walls have been broken, I think the utility companies will have to start creating value out of their ecosystem, not just look inside. I think they will need to take a very outside-in perspective. So if you take an outside-in perspective, right, I see 2 or 3 big blobs that, as you see in the slide there, right. One, of course, is the transformation that's happening on the energy management side, right. You see several stakeholders that are coming there, and the interactions between each of these stakeholders will need to be digitized, right, if value creation and customer experience needs to be enhanced. The second blob that I really see is very surprising. It's a very traditional sort of a model of creation and distribution. So the grid is taking a whole new meaning. The grid is getting digitized, or probably you could say that the grid is getting reimagined as a platform, right? But broadly, I think what's happening is that the consumer downstream is getting a visibility into what's happening upstream and midstream. I think that's the name of the game. So extending on that, the third very critical ecosystem that I'm seeing is really on the downstream side, where the entire services spectrum for the consumer is just not a commodity energy or a commodity power. It's really a whole bunch of core services, adjacent services, and value-added services, right? And these value-added services need not be necessarily pure play power or energy. It can be a whole bunch of financial services which are aligned with some of these utility companies and utility services that these traditional guys are giving. So broadly, I think it is how can you leverage the ecosystem, and how can you create newer experiences and services for your customers.